Hello everyone, it's Rob. Welcome to another episode of the 42 to Doomsday podcast, which should be released on New Year's Eve, depending on how quickly I can edit what follows after my introduction. But we'll see. Either way, Happy New Year to all our listeners. As a special treat, though special and treat may have different definitions after you all listen to this, I'm bringing to you, admittedly at Mark's insistence, a story I wrote for the publication of the Doctor Who Club of Victoria, Sonic Screwdriver. This story formed part of the 100th issue, which is quite an achievement back in the day. It may have been the last story that I wrote for Sonic, as it's known by its readers, and had written quite a lot of stories, and I'd really cut my teeth in terms of fan fiction, writing stories for Sonic. And this one is a celebration of sorts, written after the 8th Doctor's solo story was aired. It is about 15 or 20 minutes long. It is a celebration, as I mentioned before, and you'll soon work out why it's a celebration. I don't do voices, so don't expect me to be doing any sort of interpretation or in impression of any particular Doctor. I just don't do that. I don't have it in me, and I won't inflict that on everyone. So, thank you for listening. Please settle back and enjoy a celebration by me. And once again, Happy New Year to all our listeners, and all the best for 2025. "A ginger beer, if you please," said the old man, settling himself down at the head of a long dining table. He had acquired the taste in Tombstone, the only thing he had enjoyed about the stay in that wretched town. He waved away a proffered menu. No, I'm waiting for the rest of the party. Now do be a good boy and get me that ginger beer. I prefer to drink in solitude, and when the rest arrive, there'll be precious little of that." The waiter nodded curtly and made his way to the bar. The old man settled back into the stuffed chair, sighing gently as his aching back relaxed. He ran a hand through his silver hair. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a young girl staring at him, stifling a giggle at his preening. Number One frowned, which made the giggling worse. He smiled at that. Irreverence in adults was simply disrespectful, and at his age, especially his age, it was particularly intolerable, but it was the stuff little children were made of. He made a great show of patting his pockets and putting on a querulous expression. Then, feigning delight, he pulled out a small white paper bag. Opening it up, he reached inside with spidery fingers. A smile played on his lips. He pulled out a boiled sweet, which he inspected critically before popping into his mouth. The child's eyes widened in delight. Number One chewed thoughtfully on the sweet, every sigh of delight increasing the look of hunger and hope on the girl's face. Number One finished off the sweet, made to put the bag back in his pocket, then stopped, before offering it to the girl. As he did, his eyes locked with her mother's. Ordinarily, she would have whisked her daughter out of harm's way, but as she later told her neighbour, there was something about the old man's pale blue eyes which made her relent. She nodded to her daughter, who quickly took advantage of this momentary slip in her mother's relentless defence of her, and carefully took a sweet from the bag. She smiled her thanks, and overcome with embarrassment, fled back to the safety of her table. "Don't mind if I do, old fellow," came a voice. A thick-fingered hand reached down and snatched a sweet from the bag. Number One looked up to see Number Two's impish face looking down at him. They stared intently at each other for a moment, before smiles creased their faces. Number One stood, and they shook hands warmly. Number One settled back into his chair, while Number Two reached into a pocket of his checked trousers. He pulled out a paper bag, and was about to offer it to the child, who was mesmerised by the startling intensity of his blue shirt, when Number One reached out a hand. "Don't be spoiling the child, my dear boy," he gently scolded. "I'm sure her mother would far prefer her to have a decent meal of roast beef than the contents of a lolly bag." Number Two's crestfallen face matched the child's. Then he smiled. "Well, maybe for her dessert then. I'm sure she'll leave plenty of room for some sweets." He pitched his voice a little louder, just enough for the girl to hear. "I say, they've done a bit of redecorating since the last time," Number Two commented, as he ordered a glass of water. "Yes, I had a bit of a chat to the owner when I arrived. Not a patch on his grandfather, none of the sense of style the old boy had. He says something about keeping up with the times. Of course, I disagreed, but, well, you know young people today." "Yes," mused Number Two, looking downcast. "I do sometimes feel like a dinosaur, with everything changing around us. Still," he said, brightening, "at least there are children about," giving a young boy across the room a tiny wave and smile. "Gives the place a new lease of life. Better than fat merchants and retired soldiers puffing on endless cigars." He looked around the table and frowned. I say, why are there 9 seats? Number 1 had a faraway look in his eyes as he shushed his companion. A surprise, my boy, a very pleasant surprise. He was about to go on when a yellow car screeched to a halt outside. Within a few seconds, the front door swung open and in strode a tall, white-haired man. He flung a black opera cape at a startled waiter, who managed a very good impression of someone floundering under a collapsing tent. Clad in a velvet smoking jacket and white frilled shirt, Number 3 threaded his way regally between the tables, the rings on his fingers glinting in the light. He sat in his chair with a flourish, drawing a burst of applause from the children at one nearby table. He winked at them, a dazzling smile transforming his face. Settling back into his chair, he took a look around. It was then that he noticed the other 2, who had watched his arrival with amusement, and his face fell. Oh dear, I thought I was here first. Never mind, at least now that I'm here, the party can start. He leaned back as a waiter passed. Be a good chap and fetch me the wine list. There's a good fellow. The waiter stuck his nose in the air and glided off. Number 2 managed to stifle his chuckle, while Number 1's eyes sparkled with amusement. Number 3 harumphed, then noticed the young girl at the next table. Automatically he reached into a pocket and proceeded to remove the most amazing clutter. Cards, pebbles, feathers, a magnifying glass, coins and notes, keys, a stub of a pencil and a small diary rained down on the table before he found what he was looking for. A small white bag appeared with a flourish. No, said Number 1 firmly. Really, I don't know what's wrong with you 2. Let the child finish her meal, then you can spoil her rotten. Number 2 eyed his successor critically. I see you've souped her up again, nodding disapprovingly at the roadster sitting outside. Already it had gathered a crowd. Within a few minutes, several people who had gotten uncomfortably close were trying unsuccessfully to prise their hands off the car body. Laughter rose up outside as the crowd watched their useless flailing. Really, I don't understand why you're not booked more. I've begun to think your fines are the only thing supporting the British justice system. Why do you think I keep adding horsepower? Asked Number 3 haughtily, taking a careful sip of the newly arrived wine. He sighed contentedly. Keep that there. That's a good chap, he said to the waiter. Oh, and get another one out of the cellar. I'm sure I'll go through that before we're finished here. It's a celebration after all, he said loudly. He turned his attention back to Number 2. My theory is, the faster I go, the less chance they have of catching me. He smiled brightly at them both. Sheer irresponsibility, muttered Number 1. I think my talents are being frittered away by a dandy with a drinking problem. Number 2 nearly choked on a mouthful of water. In between fits of coughing, he managed to gasp out a few words. Oh, my, that was magnificent, was all he could say before he lapsed into more splutters and coughs. A number of not very gentle thumps to his back from Number 3 quickly cured that. Number 3 looked thoughtful for a moment, then chuckled to himself. He raised his glass of red to Number 1 and silently toasted him. They both nodded at each other. Then all 3 lapsed into companionable silence. By this stage, the restaurant's attention was mainly on the party of 3. Children goggled unashamedly at the men who had single-handedly steered each and every conversation in their direction. Teenagers stared at them in unashamed awe. To them, the trio had the appearance of a total lack of responsibility and an overabundance of street cred. Parents felt increasingly uncomfortable under the disappointed gaze of their children, and not a few adults felt stabs of jealousy at the antics of the trio. Somewhere in the fuzzy gap between childhood and the daily grind of 9 to 5, they had lost something those 3 still had in abundance. Of course I have a reservation, boomed a voice. Name? You silly man, John Smith. What else could it possibly be? It's not my fault the name's so common. What? At the same table? Well, coincidence is a funny thing, my good man. Now be so kind as to show me to my table. A harassed waiter, sweat beading on his pale forehead, led a tall, curly-headed man to the table. His hair positively electric in intensity, the man's face was dominated by a huge smile. With one hand, he effortlessly looped an extravagantly long scarf over the hat stand, then tossed a heavy overcoat at another hapless waiter, who promptly disappeared under its heavy folds. Number 4 pulled out a chair for himself and promptly slammed his booted feet up on the table. With impossibly long arms, he reached out and grabbed the other bottle of red. He filled a glass, lounged back, and silently greeted his fellows as he took a sip. Ah, he gasped, swinging his feet onto the floor and leaning forward. Nothing like a good red on a cold English day to get the blood racing. He beamed maniacally at his fellows. Numbers 1 and 3 found something more interesting in different corners of the room, while only Number 2 smiled in greeting. Finding once again that he was the centre of attention, Number 4 nodded greetings to the other people in the restaurant. I heartily recommend this to you all, he said, raising the glass. Got a taste for it in Paris, you know, though you can get a taste for anything in Paris, yes? His eyes twinkled. I wouldn't be drinking too much of that, you know, said Number 1 imperiously. The celebration's barely begun. Why, even the guest of honour is yet to arrive. The others nodded agreement. I mean, after the performance number 6 gave the last time we met, well, a little sobriety wouldn't go astray. Number 1 seemed almost apologetic as he said it, though his eyes looked meaningfully at the bottle. Yes, cut in number 3, especially with my bottle of red. And what's this about you getting a taste for it in Paris? If I remember correctly, I was the one who got the taste for it when Alistair and I went to Italy to look over his estate. Oh yes, said number 1 indignantly. Well, excuse me if I remind you that it was I who got the taste for it in Rome when Nero ruled. He huffed and pulled at his lapels, satisfied that he'd one-upped them all again. But number 4's attention was elsewhere. Digging deep into his pockets, another white paper bag appeared. He held it out to the delighted children. Mothers who had witnessed the previous performances simply threw up their hands in despair. Don't mind if I do, old chap, said a tall, fair-haired man, rather breathlessly. They all looked up, expectantly. Though I hope they're not as stale as the ones you bequeathed me, He looked around, a youthful smile stretching across his unlined face. He sat at the table, divesting himself of a cricket ball and the latest edition of Wisden as he did. There was a round of handshakes and greetings, and the not-too-quiet sound of several hearts breaking from the more distant tables. A passing waiter was accosted. A lemonade, if you could be so kind, and not too much sugar this time. It gives me a fearful headache, do you hear? He called after the retreating waiter. Well, number 5 said, looking eagerly around at the others. When is the guest of honour arriving? I do hope he's not as tardy as the last time. He pulled open a menu, scanning the list. Things don't seem to have changed much on the culinary front, at least. I wonder if they have any celery. His voice trailed off as his eyes fell on number 1. I do hope you got Susan home all right. My dear boy, I shouldn't be so worried, number 1 said, gently polishing the large black stone on his ring against the lapel. Susan is safe and well. David sends his regards. And these. He reached into a coat pocket and pulled out several slivers of metal. On them, holograms of different children danced in lifelike patterns. Our great-grandchildren, he said happily, passing the photos around. Almost reverently, the others gazed down at the pictures. A resonant voice interrupted their silent musings. I say, he looks like me most of all. Number 5 paled slightly, his forehead knotting. They all looked up warily at the tall, thick-set man with a mop of curly blonde hair and the most outlandish coat imaginable. Something glittered behind his eyes, and his face was covered in a thin sheen of sweat. Pulling up a chair, he mopped at his brow with a spotted handkerchief. Though he does have your nose, he said, pointing at number 1. And 3, and 4. He gave them all a serious look, then dissolved into hysterical laughter. They relaxed. The last time, chairs had begun flying around within minutes of his arrival. A pint of your finest, sirrah, he yelled at the barman, who nodded his head. There was the clink of glass as numbers 3 and 4 scrambled frantically for the remaining bottles of red. Settling into his chair with a sigh, number 6 cast a sardonic eye over his counterparts, who cradled their bottles of wine. He snorted with disdain and snatched the menu from number 5's hands. Perusing it while whistling tunelessly, he suddenly threw it down with disgust. What? After the last time? They still haven't added a vegetarian meal. He crossed his arms in annoyance, looking for all the world like a spoiled child. His face grew increasingly red, and the others shuffled slightly in their seats, each looking nervously at the other. In the end, it was number 2 who came to the rescue. Perhaps they can knock together a tossed salad. His voice was slightly strained, and he rubbed his thick, dark hands together anxiously. Number 6 looked at him lazily, his eyes flicking about cat-like. I remember you, he said slowly, confusion crossing his brow. Spain? His face broke into a glorious smile. Then he began to chuckle. Perhaps you would like to have my share of the cucumber. The shared memory brought a smile to the smaller man's face, and very quickly the tension dissolved, replaced by the former bonhomie. It was while number 3 was regaling them all with the modifications he had performed upon Bessie that number 7 made his appearance. A waiter glided over to the table, a silver platter in hand. From it, he plucked a yellowed envelope. A letter for Mr. John Smith, he said, his eyebrows raised curiously. That's me, they all said in unison. Who's it from? Unfazed by this unexpected turn, the waiter checked the back. I believe it is from Brigadier Alastair Gordon Lethbridge Stewart, K.B.E., with the exception of number 1. They all looked at each other in surprise. A smile playing on his lips, number 1 flicked a hand at the waiter. Well, do bring it here. We haven't all day. The waiter nodded, handing the letter to the old man. Good grief, said number 2, leaning in to take a closer look. That's a penny black on the envelope. The others looked at each other knowingly. They had been expecting something like this. Tearing open the envelope, number 1 fished out a single sheet of paper. He paused, then muttered angrily to himself, patting at his pockets. He flicked a hand at number 5. Do be a good boy and hand me my glasses. Number 5 pulled his spectacles from an inner pocket. They were passed carefully to the head of the table. When they were perched on number 1's nose, he read aloud from the note. "Doctor, the doctor says you should look behind you." As one they turned. From the kitchens, to the accompaniment of an outraged head chef, 2 men emerged. One was tall, greying, with a slight paunch and a carefully clipped moustache, dressed in his best blazer and pants. The other was short, dark and intense. His clothes consisted of a red tie, raw silk shirt and dark pants. "Ta-da!" said number 7 and flashed them a knowing smile. The brigadier had broken away from him and was busily accepting handshakes and backslaps from those around the table. "I simply couldn't resist," explained number 7 to number 6 later as he peeled a grape taken from the fruit bowl. Looking up at his predecessor, he couldn't resist one small barb. "By the way, how's the head?" That had cost the owner a chair and forced a terrified family to flee, but things had been quickly smoothed over. The party moved on into the late afternoon. Numbers 3 and 4 were by now, respectively, into their 7th bottle of wine. 2 and 6 were busily explaining the finer intricacies of Spanish cuisine to 1 and 5 when another arrival silenced them all. The entire restaurant fell into a deep hush. The owner, who had been told by his father that he might one day serve such an idiosyncratic party as this, saw him first. Then they all did. A high forehead, full lips, and long, flowing dark hair. Thin, sensitive fingers rose hesitantly to his mouth, unsure of what to say or do. The eyes were deep, almost soulful, and they could all see by the way the corner of his mouth quirked that he was full of pent-up humour and the joy of life. All that was needed to bring it forth was... Number 1 stood and looked over them solemnly. "Here is my family," he thought to himself. Rude, rambunctious children, all of them. But with Susan leading her own life, they were all the family he had, and he wouldn't have had it any other way. "My dear boy," he said, "would you be so good as to join us?" The smile erupted then, and the uncertainty flowed away. He nodded and laughed, a full-throated laugh that washed over them all. "It would be an utter pleasure," said number 8, pulling up a chair. The brigadier quickly charged everyone's glasses and stood, his own glass in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it has been my privilege to have known the finest man alive 7 times over. Now, today marks the 8th occasion. A toast to the doctor, the doctors, damn fine chaps." He roared the last words to a cheer and the clinking of glasses from all those seated around him. All of them.